This morning we're going to be able to discuss the commercialization of fusion energy, one of the critical and emerging technologies that we're in a global race to develop. Fusion energy would be a total game changer. It's dispatchable power that's zero emitting, and unlike conventional nuclear fission, we have abundant and accessible fuel for fusion with minimal waste. We know energy has played a major role in spurring the wars of the past century, from Japan's dependence on imported oil in World War II to Europe's dependence on Russian natural gas and conflicts in the Middle East. But widely available fusion power would help end conflicts over energy. It would change the world. In 2022, I visited the ITER experimental site in Provence, France, where the U.S. and 32 other countries are working together to get the first fusion reactor online, commercial, including not just our allies, but also countries of concern, such as China and Russia. While we're in conflict on other geopolitical issues, we are cooperating on ITER because all of these countries see the merit and promise of fusion energy. ITER gave me hope, and I saw a real opportunity for this technology to bring us together here in the United States. I saw, in a sense, world peace. What I saw there changed my outlook on energy forever. And I really encourage all of you to make the trip there if you have not been able to do so. Please do so. What we are doing with fusion power is essentially trying to...
And if you can't go to France, come to Wyoming.
And West Virginia. I thought I was going to have a protest for my good friend here and my partner. What I saw there changed my outlook on energy forever, and I will encourage all of you to make that trip. What we are doing with fusion is essentially trying to harness the power of the stars here on Earth. Lightweight elements fuse together and in the process release massive amounts of energy. But it is much more challenging to artificially produce fusion here on Earth because of the difference in gravity, which means that we need to create temperatures 10 times hotter than the sun here in our labs. And believe it or not, we are actually able to do that today. But despite our scientific progress to date, challenges remain that are preventing us from having operational fusion power plants today. Currently, there are over 40 fusion companies globally that have raised a collective $7.1 billion of investment over the past 5 years. And over 85% of that is private capital. And there have been significant advances in fusion energy technology in recent years, such as the National Ignition Facility at the Lawrence Livermore National Lab, achieving fusion ignition, for the first time producing more energy from fusion than was used to drive the reaction. This is the only facility in the world to reach that milestone. And we are also seeing many of these new designs making fusion reactors smaller, similar to how the nuclear fission industry is innovating from the large conventional reactors to the SMR, small modular reactors, and microreactors. But despite decades of research and rapid increase in global investment in fusion energy technologies, no one has been able to produce fusion energy at the grid level commercial scale. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about the roadblocks that they are seeing. I understand that there are still outstanding scientific questions that need to be answered, which the Energy Act of 2020 and CHIPS and the Science Act aim to help address. And I know DOE's fusion energy program is busy implementing these laws and working with the private sector to coordinate efforts. But I've recently learned that ITER continues to face delays, and its new startup date is now 2029, 4 years later than we'd hoped. So we need to get a better understanding of why that is and how we can get things back on track. Meanwhile, the private sector seems to be charging ahead. Helion Energy, one of our witnesses today, recently visited a Nucor steel facility in my home state of West Virginia, where the two companies are considering co-locating steel production with fusion plant. It's really exciting, and everyone's kind of all hepped up about this. Helion is looking for an online date for their first grid-scale commercial fusion power plant in 2028. That would be more than a decade before ITER, and it almost seems too good to be true. Now, I understand that ITER and Helion's plant are designed for different purposes, but it's clear from these examples that there is a lot of uncertainty surrounding the potential deployment date for the first fusion power plant. I would be remiss not to mention that the race against China, and we've discussed time and time again, and this committee applies here as well. China has recently mimicked our own U.S. strategic plan for developing fusion energy and is rapidly building out their research program and labs, modeled after our own DOE national labs. As you can see in the chart behind me, Fusion investments have ramped up in the past few years. The U.S. is still in the lead, but you can see China entering the field in a big way. In 2023, China's investments in 2023 are more than all of the other countries combined, including ours. And China is not only trying to beat us in science, they're also working to corner the fusion energy supply chain by securing the market for critical materials needed to build fusion power plants, like that have for solar power and electric vehicle batteries. We cannot afford to lose our competitive edge in fusion energy technology. I'm looking forward to hearing from you all about the timeline we are facing for fusion power and about specific steps that we can take to ensure America is able to maintain our competitive edge. With that, I'm going to turn to my friend, Senator Brasso, for his opening remarks.
Well,
and I won't interject at all.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Please feel free to interject. We have a great working relationship. I'm so proud of what we were able to do with permitting. I continue to hear about the success of a bill that came out of this committee. All of us here, sitting here today, voted for it, 15-4, and I'd like to get that on the floor of the Senate as quickly as possible.
Amen.
And thank you for holding this hearing today, and I'd like also, as quickly as possible, to see this come to fruition, what we're talking about today. This is a critically important topic, nuclear fusion. It's a process of combining two elements, such as hydrogen, to create a heavier element and generate energy. That's what it's about, generating energy. It is the atomic reaction that powers our sun, and if harnessed here on Earth, offers unlimited emission-free energy, often considered the holy grail of energy production. This committee last considered nuclear fusion. It doesn't seem that long ago, but it was actually 2 years ago that we had the hearing on this, and since then there has been some noteworthy progress that's been made. In December of 2022, the Department of Energy announced that scientists at the Lawrence Livermore National Lab achieved scientific break-even. This occurs when a fusion experiment produces more energy than it uses. And since then, the scientists at the Lawrence Livermore National Lab have been able to repeat this process on 4 additional occasions. Over the last 2 years, we have also witnessed growth of the fusion industry. 2022, there were 33 companies working on this in the private sector. Now there are 45. According to the Fusion Industry Association, these companies have attracted over $7 billion of private investment, with over $900 million in new funding just in the last year. So it's clear that investors do see great potential in fusion. While these developments are encouraging, we need to remain clear-eyed about the challenges ahead. No question that scientific break-even was significant, yet scientists have not yet been able to reliably and consistently reproduce the reactant. Mastering scientific break-even is necessary before nuclear fusion can be commercially available. Another challenge that scientists face is converting fusion energy into electricity. To date, no fusion reactor has made it to this stage. Yet several fusion companies expect to put electrons on the grid in the next decade. Helion, one of our witnesses today, has signed a power purchase agreement to provide Microsoft with electricity by 2028. Helion has signed an agreement to provide electricity to Nucor, a steel producer, around 2030. I'm interested to hear how the plans from Helion are to meet these ambitious commitments. Advances in fusion energy come at a time when America's demand for electricity is expected to grow rapidly. I brought an article here previously from the New York Times saying by 5 years from now that the need for energy nationwide would be like adding a new California to the grid as a result of all the areas where new energy is needed. And much of this demand is going to be driven by data centers powering artificial intelligence, by Bitcoin mining, by cloud computing, storage centers. If we can't provide these facilities with affordable and reliable power, America is going to cede its leadership position to these critical technology. China understands this. They understand the race for artificial intelligence is also a race to secure the energy to power the computers. This is one reason why China is aggressively competing with us on fusion. Mr. Chairman, I think you and I talked about this Wall Street Journal article headline. This was Tuesday, July 9th. Beijing leads U.S. in fusion race. You can see that over here. Yeah, that's this year.
That's this year, but it's not quite accurate compared to what we've been able to do in the past.
Apparently it's fake news, but I'm not convinced. I'm concerned. It's a concern that...
We're not out of the race yet. Don't give up on the U.S.
It quotes Dr. Helion, who leads the Department of Energy's Fusion Office and is one of our witnesses here today. So we're going to get that, because according to your quote in this article, China appears to be following our roadmap of how to commercialize fusion energy. Yeah, so they tend to have they have this ability to copycat what we do and then try to advance it in ways to get ahead of us, to leapfrog us. His quote is, "They're building our long-range plan," and you say that's very frustrating, as you can imagine, because that's the way China does it on so many things. So I'm interested to learn what we need to do to protect American interests and regain our competitive advantage. I would also like to learn how the department can become a better steward of taxpayer dollars when it comes to fusion research. I want to thank the witnesses for being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to the testimony. I know everyone here does.
Thank you, Senator. I'm going to introduce our panelists today. We have Dr. John Paul Helion, who goes by JP, Associate Director for Fusion Energy Sciences at the Department of Energy. We have Ms. Jackie Siebens, Director of Public Affairs at Helion Energy. And we have Dr. Patrick White, Research Director at Nuclear Innovation Institute. Thank you all for coming. Now we're going to start with you all. And Dr. JP, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrazo, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for your longstanding support of fusion energy sciences research and development. As Associate Director of Fusion Energy Sciences, or FES, in the Department of Energy's Office of Science, it is an honor to testify about our work to realize the promise of fusion energy. In alignment with the administration's bold decadal vision for commercial fusion energy. Simultaneously, we are also working to align with the recommendations of the Fusion Energy Sciences Advisory Committee Long-Range Plan. I want to thank this committee for the strong support for the entire Office of Science and fusion specifically, reflected in the historic CHIPS and Science Act of 2022. This past year, we have made tremendous strides. We began to realign the FES program to meet the rapidly changing fusion landscape, introduce new innovative funding mechanisms, and deepen international partnerships with like-minded nations. All the while, we have maintained our focus on the important foundational and enabling science that we steward for the nation, which has the potential to harness fusion energy and also deliver new plasma technologies that can improve human health, revolutionize microelectronics manufacturing, and more. The promise of fusion energy cannot be understated. Harnessing energy from fusion reactions has the potential to unlock a resilient baseload and carbon-free source of energy, essential to combating climate change. Further, with such broad and transformative potential, it is essential that we treat fusion energy as a national security imperative. The United States cannot afford to have other nations surpass its technological leadership and competitive edge. To realize fusion energy in a decadal timeframe, we must take bold action to address the critical scientific and technological gaps that remain and enable fusion energy to scale. At FES, our approach to realizing this bold decadal vision is built on three key actions. First, we must drive innovation by closing critical science and technology gaps. Investing in fusion energy sciences to align with the bold decadal vision, as well as recommendations of the FESAC long-range plan, will help us accelerate at the necessary speed and scale. Second, we must establish and leverage public-private partnerships. The proposed public-private consortium frameworks enable participants from across the economy to support the development of fusion science and technology to realize commercial fusion energy. Participants might include academia, government labs, private equity, loan programs, state and regional governments, philanthropic investors, and large-scale industries and corporations. Third, we must build a robust fusion technology manufacturing network alongside partners. This investment will produce innovations and scale essential fusion technologies, including internal components, advanced materials, and tritium management systems needed to make fusion economically competitive at scale. This coming fiscal year, we will release the first ever U.S. Fusion Science and Technology Roadmap, laying out the steps needed to advance each of these actions and clear metrics with input from industry to measure progress every year. To close, we're in one of the most consequential moments of development for fusion energy. Translating decades of scientific and technological progress to a globally competitive energy resource will require significant investment and effort. History has taught us the magnitude of effort needed to deploy and scale up novel technologies. Like the first moonshot, the nation will need the foresight and will to bring together our collective expertise and willingness to innovate across technology and policy if we're to win the race to commercial fusion energy. As we face challenges to our national, economic, and energy security, fusion energy is a mandate that we must realize to ensure global leadership this century and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll turn to Ms. Siebens.
Thank you. Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the steps necessary to position the United States as the leader in a global fusion marketplace. It is an honor to speak before you, especially at such an inflection point for fusion technology, with China trying to capitalize on our success. Helion is based in Everett, Washington, and is a company of over 350 people with a mission to provide the world with clean, reliable, and abundant energy through commercial fusion technology. Over the past decade, we have developed 6 fusion prototypes, each reaching our goals of proving critical aspects of our approach and bringing us closer to commercial deployment. Today, we are building Polaris, our 7th prototype, which we expect to be the first machine to demonstrate electricity production. Following Polaris, we will construct the world's first commercial fusion power plant backed by a power purchase agreement with Microsoft. We also have a customer agreement with Nucor to develop a 500 megawatt plant to power one of their steel mills. This shows that fusion energy is no longer a distant vision. It is becoming a reality today. But as exciting as this moment may be, deployment at scale is where the real race is. To meet projected energy demand growth and to secure U.S. leadership, we must prepare to deploy not just one, but many fusion power plants across America and the globe. And this requires a strategic two-pronged approach. First, building resilient supply chains, and second, establishing bold new regulatory pathways. There are several things we must do to bolster our supply chains, including adapting existing government programs to fusion, such as the Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office, the 45X Manufacturing Production Tax Credit, and the CHIPS and Science Act. But eventually, we also need to develop a new bold program for fusion, akin to the CHIPS Act. It should include strategic manufacturing support to provide significant funding to build out the manufacturing capacity necessary for large-scale fusion deployment and move the U.S. towards applied materials R&D. And when it comes to regulation, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and Congress have already made incredible strides. However, significant opportunities remain as we move toward commercialization. Fusion generators are capable of being mass-produced, but they are currently licensed for each individual site. We have a proposal called design-specific licensing, where fusion generators are treated like airplanes, where you license the design with the ability to site and operate the generator at any location nationwide. For environmental reviews, we must develop a tailored environmental regulatory approach, much like licensing, for the generator design and not bucket fusion into the years-long processes that apply to fission. It is also important to look at grid interconnection and siting regulation, as the current system is not designed for scale. Federal and state regulators must work together to streamline interconnection processes to integrate fusion generators into the grid as soon as they are ready. Also, we must look at co-located generation, where power can be directly supplied to large energy consumers like data centers without the need for extensive grid infrastructure. We recognize these ambitious asks in support of ambitious goals, but when a fusion company hits electricity production, these efforts need to be ready to go on day one to make sure fusion can scale in a competition where China will put everything on the table to win. China has made fusion a cornerstone of its national innovation strategy, aggressively investing in research, development, and manufacturing capabilities, both for civilian and military applications. It is estimated China spends $1.5 billion a year on fusion and has 10 times as many PhDs as America in this space. And China has a history of replicating US companies' designs to develop their own systems. This is happening right now in fusion with multiple Chinese companies. One company launched a direct copycat program pursuing Helion's design, and another publicly stated its intent to replicate key aspects of Helion's approach. We've seen it before in solar and batteries, where the US pioneered breakthrough technologies only to lose out to China in the race to mass deployment. Without a comprehensive US response, we risk being outpaced by China again. This is why it is imperative for the US to act now. By establishing resilient supply chains and the right regulatory frameworks, we can ensure that fusion transforms our energy system and secures America's leadership in the clean energy transition. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Now we'll turn to Dr. White.
Great, thank you. Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today before this committee and for holding this hearing. My name is Dr. Patrick White, and I'm currently the Research Director for the Nuclear Innovation Alliance. Through a partnership with the Clean Air Task Force on their global program for fusion energy, I also lead the CATF International Working Group on Commercial Fusion Safety, Waste, and Nonproliferation. Both NIA and CATF are 501c3 organizations that provide independent technical research, analysis, and advocacy to help advance policies and technologies that enable deployment of clean energy solutions to meet our economic, societal, and climate needs. I hold a PhD in nuclear science and engineering from MIT, where my doctoral thesis work focused on the safety, analysis, regulation, and licensing of commercial fusion technology. I'm here today to provide insights on the development and deployment of fusion energy technology as an important future clean energy solution. An affordable, reliable, secure, and clean energy future requires us to deploy a mix of variable clean energy generation, energy storage, and firm clean energy generation. Commercial fusion energy could play a significant role as a source of firm clean energy generation and would complement other existing firm clean energy sources, including hydroelectric, nuclear fission, geothermal, and natural gas with carbon capture. Successful development, commercialization, and deployment and export of commercial fusion energy by the United States will have climate, societal, economic, and geopolitical benefits, including affordable clean energy, technology innovation spurred on by fusion energy research, onshore supply chains and domestic manufacturing, and increased energy security for us and our allies. The past 5 years have seen incredible achievements by fusion experiments in the United States and around the world, and record investment in private companies pursuing commercial fusion energy. And while we have passed several important milestones in the development and commercialization of fusion energy, I believe it's important to contextualize and discuss the pathway and future milestones that still lie ahead. A clear understanding of these milestones, their timing, and the pathways enables us to discuss how we can most effectively catalyze and accelerate the development, commercialization, and ultimate wide-scale deployment of fusion energy. The commercialization and deployment of fusion energy can be divided into 4 general phases. The first is the development and operation of scientific demonstration fusion machines that show we can control fusion energy and achieve net energy gain from fusion reactions. Second, the design and testing of engineering demonstration fusion machines that show we can harness fusion energy and consistently produce large amounts of power from fusion reactions. Third, the construction and operation of commercial demonstration machines that show that we can produce commercially relevant energy products from fusion and integrate key commercial systems necessary for wide-scale deployment. And fourth and finally is the wide-scale commercial deployment of fusion energy, marking the availability of the technology as a viable clean energy source. Fusion commercialization will require private companies to complete all 4 phases, but company-specific pathways may differ. Some concepts may be completed under a single demonstration phase, with one machine serving as a scientific, an engineering, and a commercial machine, while other companies may take a more iterative approach and use many smaller machines to show how their technology can develop and evolve towards a commercial product. But understanding these phases enables us to more clearly discuss and compare the progress that's currently being made by private fusion companies and assess how the federal government can most effectively support and accelerate the commercialization of fusion technology. Moving forward, the United States needs to consider what role we want to play in the global race for fusion energy. Fusion technology innovation by U.S. companies is unmatched, but we need to ensure that they have the support and policy clarity to compete internationally against state-owned or state-supported fusion energy programs. The United Kingdom, European Union, China, Canada, Japan, and other nations have begun making investments in commercial fusion energy, and United States partnerships with the United Kingdom and Japan on fusion energy research highlight the opportunities for international collaboration with our allies, and supporting domestic development of a U.S. fusion industry is critical. As an example, China has a plan for domestic fusion energy and a domestic fusion industry, and they're executing on it. They've started construction on scientific and engineering demonstration fusion machines, and they have a detailed plan on a commercial demonstration fusion machine. They're also completing a facility that will lead cross-cutting fusion research and development for key materials, fuel cycle technologies, and commercial systems. The Chinese plan shows both an understanding and a commitment to the scientific, engineering, and commercial steps necessary to get fusion energy onto the grid. Accelerating fusion commercial development and deployment in the United States will require private sector investment and continued federal government's coordination and support. I believe two major factors should be prioritized as we work towards the commercialization of fusion energy. First, we need to ensure that clean energy policies are technology inclusive to create a clear market pull for fusion energy as a firm, clean energy source. Second, private companies, academic researchers, national labs, and the federal government must closely coordinate and collaborate to implement and support, with appropriate federal funding and policies, an integrated fusion energy program that effectively and efficiently prioritizes efforts to accelerate fusion energy commercialization through all four stages of development, demonstration, and deployment. Thank you.
Let me thank all of you, and we're going to start our questioning now. So this is really for all three, but what I want to know is I'm encouraged to hear what we're doing and things of that sort. I'm concerned when I hear China now is doubling down and coming stronger and stronger at us. I want to take the lead on that. So I'm going to ask the hard question: when can we realistically expect the first fusion power plant to be online? And I know there's all difference, but with ITER being knocked back as far as it is, which really alarmed us, how do you expect something to come on quicker than that? And why would you be able to do it on a smaller scale when they can't do it on a commercialized scale? Dr. JP, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this question. There's no question that we're in a race, and I'm glad that you point this out. The realization of fusion energy is one of the most significant challenges to mankind. So we need to recognize that as we're putting together a lot of our expertise and leveraging a lot of our resources, we need to keep in mind that it's really important to have our eye on the ball and very much focus on closing these science and technology gaps that we've been talking about. The good news is, after decades of investments in the public program and the public sector, these have actually enabled the private sector to have and been able to step up the investments towards fusion technology development. And this is good news. We have a signal, if you will, from the private sector.
You're thinking the private sector is going to come on before the public sector, right?
Well, I think
able to instigate it. I'm just trying. I only have so much time.
Right.
I wanted to make sure, but I think I know where you're coming from on that. What you all have been able, what we've been able to do with public investments and research through our labs, is basically propelling the private sector to take it and run with it quicker.
Well, that's true, but it's also about building bridges between the public and private sectors. This is key, right?
Stevens,
it's not.
do you have any,
it's not just the private sector. Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Stevens. Do you have any comment, real quick, on that?
Yes, thank you for that question, Senator. I'll start by sort of taking a 50,000-foot view of the whole sort of fusion ecosystem and where we're at today versus where we have been.
Well, you all believe you can come on before 2030.
That is correct, indeed.
Well, how come? I want to hear that one.
Right. So first of all, right now we have 21st century technology advancement that's enabling 20th century concepts. So for us at Helion, we're pursuing something called a pulsed approach to fusion. And when you look at things like ITER, which you've discussed, and many of the other companies, they're pursuing something called a tokamak design, which has been the predominant design that's been pursued over the past many decades. And in both of those instances, we have technologies available today that we haven't had before that are accelerating this race towards commercialization and building that first working machine. Combined with the fact that the regulatory framework for fusion allows companies like Helion to actually build and iterate and build again quickly, that is absolutely key for us moving quickly. For instance, for us at Helion, we've built 6 working fusion machines since we were founded approximately 11 years ago. You can't do that in almost any other field, and fission, it takes a very long time to get regulatory approval to build. So the fact that we have technology advancements, particularly in power electronics for us at Helion, combined with a regulatory framework that allows us to build and iterate, has really led us to a place where we're moving quickly, with our pulse machine particularly.
Mr. White, real quick, Dr. White. And we're going to go to 7 minutes because with what we have here, I think it entails that. Go ahead.
Great, thank you, Senator Manchin. I think the real answer to why we think we can get fusion energy on the grid more quickly is technology innovation. If you take a look at almost all of the private fusion companies that are currently developing technologies, they're all leveraging innovation in things like high-temperature superconducting magnets, new power electronics, new laser technologies, and this is really what is enabling them to move faster and get better performance out of machines that have been developed at national labs for the last several decades. The challenge is, with innovation, the timeline of that can be uncertain. And so we've got a lot of very promising concepts. It really is up to the private industry to work through the innovation process and figure out if these enabling technologies can rapidly accelerate the deployment of fusion energy.
Let me throw this at you. Since we know that, and we know also the constraints we have on the grid system, do you believe you see an impediment there that might cause you a problem coming on, even if you have this technology? And I'll give you a perfect example. In my state, we have retired coal plants, some of the older ones. They already have the switch gears, everything's ready to go. And we've had SMRs, small market, looking at that. Do you all look at that type of a facility that's like a plug and play? If you can get this going, would that be attractive to you all? And are you concerned about the constraints you have hooking to the grid the way we have it now, unless we are able to pass permitting, which enables us to have, and how important is that to you all, the permitting?
Thank you for that question. And yes, we are looking at co-location. That is, when we look at our customers and where their demand is, there's a lot of demand around co-location. For our first deployment, we're in good shape, but where we see the real race developing is beyond that first demonstration, that first deployment of a commercial facility,
Gotcha.
and building out and deploying at scale. That's where the real race with China is. And to your point, that's where we do see challenges in being able to deploy our machines at the rate that we can build them and to meet the demand that we see. I think the permitting bill goes a long way in helping ensure that we're able to connect to the grid and solve some of the transmission issues that we're facing. But when it comes to co-location, which you mentioned, in regulated markets, there's not currently a pathway that exists for a 500 megawatt facility like ours to serve electricity directly to a customer like Nucor. So I think there's a lot of work still to be done in the space of co-location.
Gotcha. Anybody else want to comment on that?
Yes, let me just expand on it. And we must remember that ITER, you referenced ITER, is not intended to be a commercial machine. However, it's an industrial scale platform.
They were trying to prove on a commercial scale that it can be.
That's right. And we should remember that, in fact, the impact of ITER already at that industrial scale level has impacted a lot of the supply chain aspects. For example, in manufacturing, let's say magnets, and in terms of tritium-based systems, this is another aspect that we're in fact benefiting from that particular project, and that's something that we don't have to wait until
Let me just tell you,
2029.
the thing that impressed me more than anything was 33 different countries have scientists at ITER. I would encourage everyone in the Energy Committee to get a chance, take a go there. It's worth it. But to have them work in collaboration and sharing this, and countries that we have concern with, China and Russia, still paying their share to be part of this.
Yeah, there's over about $1.4 billion that's been invested in the U.S., 120 companies that's benefited from this, and we're trying to leverage that.
Dr. White, you have something very quick in closing?
Yes, I'll just really quickly reiterate, I believe the importance of having technology-neutral policies to really think about how we can get firm clean energy sources onto the grid.
Right.
We hope to see many of these sources come online in the next decade, and so having a clear pathway for them to either work behind the meter or integrate onto the grid will be critical so that technologies like fusion can enter the grid when they're commercially ready.
Great. Senator Brasso.
Well, I just want to follow the direction of your questioning, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Stevens, you know, your company is very confident that it's going to be able to generate electricity from fusion. More and more companies are getting into this area. In May of 2023, your company entered into this power purchase agreement to provide electricity to Microsoft around 2028. To date, no one has been able to generate electricity from fusion, yet last year you announced that it is expected to demonstrate the ability to produce electricity in 2024, which is this year. Are you still on track to show it can produce electricity by the end of this year? We're talking, you know, less than 2.5 months to go.
Thank you for that question, Senator. Right now, we're constructing our 7th prototype called Polaris, and this is the machine that we expect will demonstrate electricity production. We are on track to complete construction of this plant this year and begin testing likely this year, and then continue that through next year. And yes, this is the machine that we believe will demonstrate electricity production, which is key to meeting the requirements of that PPA.
So since we sometimes ask one witness to comment on something or other, Dr. White, you know, companies like Helion generated significant excitement about their prospects for fusion energy. Are we really just a few years away from bringing fusion energy onto the grid?
Great, thank you for the question, Senator. I think this is where the topic of technology innovation really becomes the most important issue to discuss. Companies like Helion are using innovative approaches to generating fusion energy, but a lot of that is based on innovative technology approaches. And these are things that we're going to discover through the development, demonstration, and testing process. And so I think it's really exciting to watch the progress that Helion is making in this space, and ultimately we'll be looking to them as they test their machines to see if they can perform and produce the electricity that they believe could be really impactful. And I think this is something across the space. How can we look to innovative technologies to really accelerate fusion, not just for Helion, but for many of the different private fusion companies in the space? But ultimately, the proof will be in electrons on the grid.
Great. So good, Stevens, the power purchase agreement that you have with Microsoft. I think lots of people are interested to learn the specifics of these agreements. I'm curious to know whether the agreement includes a firm deadline date by which Helion must provide electricity to Microsoft, and interested to know whether it includes meaningful penalties if you don't meet the deadline. And what, if any, details can you share about the agreement?
Sure. I can't share every detail of the agreement, but I can say that, yes, this indeed is a real PPA that comes with firm penalties. We do have penalties that evolve and change as we grow closer to the milestone of actually producing commercial power for Microsoft. And yes, we do have deadlines. So for 2028, we need to have the plant constructed and begin operations, and then reach full commercial operations, providing electricity to Microsoft in 2029.
Dr. White, earlier this year, Representative Beyer from Virginia, you know, he's co-chair of the House Fusion Energy Caucus. He said that much of the U.S. fusion spending goes to legacy programs, not the, I think his quote was, not the cutting edge stuff. Is it time for Congress to reorder our priorities when it comes to fusion research?
Thank you. So I think it's really important when we talk about a lot of these legacy programs, as was described by Representative Beyer, and thinking about the larger fusion energy portfolio, how can we try to refocus what their activities are towards fusion energy commercialization? A lot of the machines that we operate today and a lot of the international programs that we're in can provide really important scientific and engineering information to help accelerate the private industry. Insights and work done at ITER on the design, manufacturing, construction of the ITER device, and a lot of the design work that was done to support that could be incredibly valuable for U.S. private fusion companies. The question is, how can we make sure that U.S. private companies in the U.S. fusion energy sector can get access to a lot of these lessons learned? And I think when we talk about U.S. fusion energy experiments, how can we make sure that they're really tailored and focused on either training scientists, producing research, or testing the system structures and components that are going to be needed for fusion energy? And so I think a lot of it is really having this focused plan on how to best use both the legacy experiments and the international collaborations that we have.
So, Dr. Lyon, yeah.
Yes.
You know, like, it's no surprise how China's approaching fusion. Just like they've done with other innovative technologies, they let us do all the hard work, and then they try to copycat it, steal it in anything they can. They steal our ideas. They lock up the supply chains for raw materials, magnets, capacitors, semiconductors. You know all of this. The list goes on. What's the Department of Energy going to do to protect America's growing energy fusion industry, our industry?
Yeah, thank you, Senator, for that question. And I think it connects with a lot of the comments here as well. What we have to do is we have to be very focused on making sure that we're not only just closing the science and technology gaps, but that we have a roadmap, a direction that provides us not just the timeline, but the way that we prioritize. so-called legacy assets that we have, these are not just facilities. These are ecosystems. And what's really important to recognize, these ecosystems are working not just on fusion science, they're working also on development of the very tools that are enabling many of the private sector companies. Those ecosystems as well are what ties us to our international partners, and in fact, why the globe and why the world comes to the United States for many of their projects for us to be able to develop it. The key piece here is basically, as was just shared here by my colleagues, is making sure that we're understanding the bridge to the private sector, identifying where those gaps have to be addressed, and making sure we take advantage of the resources and the assets that already exist.
Well, Mr. Chairman, thanks for going to 7 minutes because I have 2 more questions. Ms. Stevens, I understand fusion companies have raised over $7 billion now across the board from the private sector. What types of metrics do investors use when they're trying to assess, different companies' performance?
Thank you for that great question. And it gives me a chance to talk about the diligence that we went through with both of our customers. We actually started talking to Nucor, as an example, back in 2021 and went through a very, very, in-depth process with them, sharing what we could with them to have them in a place where they felt comfortable and excited about signing an energy development agreement with us for that 500 megawatt plant. Similarly with Microsoft, same thing. Both of these companies are very conservative and are very serious about announcing and pursuing an agreement of this type with us moving forward.
And Dr. White, my final question. So, some people say nuclear fusion inherently safe. Could you discuss a little bit safety benefits as well as potential hazards associated with fusion technology?
Thank you so much for that question, Senator Barrasso. I spent 3 years on my doctoral thesis working on it, so help to give you the quick highlights version of it.
There we go.
I'll go very quickly. Really, it's when you start looking at fusion reactions, they are producing, at least with some reactions, neutrons. And those neutrons that are produced can have the property of activating materials, causing them to become radioactive, and then producing additional forms of radiation. The challenge there is we need to make sure that we have a way to control and confine that type of radiation that's produced and have a pathways for its disposal in the long term. We need to make sure that we're protecting workers, public, and the environment for any materials that might be produced as byproducts during the fusion reactions and in fusion machines. The other thing that we'll need to consider is the tritium that is used in some fusion fuel cycles is a radioactive form of hydrogen. While we have experience in the United States with handling tritium safely, we need to make sure that we continue those processes as we scale it up to industrial fusion energy. And so I think we do have pathways on how to maintain safety, but it is something that's going to need to be a continued focus as we think about commercialization and fusion energy. But luckily, we have organizations like the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that are focused on this and are developing the regulations and guidance necessary, as well as the agreement states that are going to take a leading role in the licensing of fusion energy technology in the near term.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Heinrich.
Thank you, Chairman. And I want to thank the Chairman for recently joining the Fusion Caucus, as well as Senator King, and would very much welcome other members on this. Senator Todd Young has joined. We would love to have Senator Barrasso and Senator Padilla. I think this is an incredibly important opportunity for us, and as it's been articulated, like, we've led on this for 70 years. And those efforts, however, have largely been physics-based, right? We spent a lot of time figuring out the process to make fusion successful. We're now at a place where we're shifting our focus to engineering and material science and all the things that it takes, not just to prove that you can do this stuff in a lab, but to actually produce electrons on the grid. And I do want to enter in another article. I'd ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chair. It's the U.S. led on nuclear fusion for decades. Now China is in a position to win the race. And this is what we need to make sure that we have the right
Without objection.
to avoid. So talk to me from any of you about the proper role of the DOE and government right now to shift our focus from our historic focus to one of supporting technology agnostic support structures to develop those materials that can survive in this environment, all of the engineering pieces that are going to be necessary for commercial development. How do we support not pick winners and losers, but support the industry across the board and just see who gets there the fastest. JP, you
If
wanna
I
start?
may, yeah, thank you, Senator. One of the important aspects to realize is that in those 70 years that you speak about, a lot of the physics also were able to establish important technological questions. For example, in the early 70s, we recognized that stainless steel walls were not going to enable us to sustain these reactions, that we needed to move to carbon. Later on, of course, we realized, well, graphite-based systems are not going to make it, and now we need to go to high-temperature materials like tungsten. We are in a unique position today because there's been significant technological advancements outside of fusion. For example, AI/ML has been a tool that we've taken much advantage, and the convergence with fusion, I would argue, is going to be one of the key elements for us to have that competitive edge. How does government participate? What is our role in what is a burgeoning private sector activity right now in fusion? Our role is there to target and focus steady on the common gaps of many of these approaches. For example, for those that are approaching tritium, using that as a fuel, tritium fuel cycle, blanket technology, advanced materials that need to survive those extreme conditions. Those are areas that the public program has not, in fact, prioritized in the past. And as was mentioned earlier, we really have to be decisive, focused, and swiftly then pivot and align to exactly address those gaps.
Do the two of you from the private sector agree with that kind of approach, a gaps-based approach?
Yep. Thank you, Senator, for the question. I'll say from Helion's perspective, we are very interested in seeing an increase in applied materials R&D. And at the end of the day, this is about making sure that we're focusing on commercial relevant work and really weaving that more into what is happening within the DOE ecosystem as it relates to fusion. I'll just give you a quick example so we can kind of dive into what we mean by applied here. For us, we'd love to see a large multi-technology project where we tackle how to build and commercialize new reliable materials for things like first walls so that we can get to scaled deployment. And a lot of times we have materials that work for that first machine to demonstrate, but we really still have some
That's
R&D
different
gaps
than
to
surviving
scale.
in that environment
Precisely.
long-term.
Correct.
Yeah.
And I think just building on that, fusion materials is a perfect place for the federal government to take a lead on this. One of the challenges that I think that we have in kind of thinking about the long-term development, deployment of commercial fusion energy really is, how do we design a fusion machine if we've never operated a fusion machine? It's a bit of a chicken and the egg problem. And to actually develop a lot of the scientific and engineering data that we need, creation of large national test facilities to do materials research, to do neutron irradiation of materials, and help develop and really optimize new alloys is critical to ultimately creating materials that can help facilitate the safe and economic production of fusion power. And that's something where it might be too large of a lift for any one private fusion company to take on, but a federally government-led program could allow for essentially the collective development of that really critical experience and really critical materials data.
If I could add, Senator, also, it's not only the investments we're making and priorities, but in our community, I always share this when I do my visits to various performers, it's a change in how we think about fusion, how we do fusion, is asking the right questions and making sure that we're building those bridges. So for example, we've talked a lot about the public-private consortium frameworks, which we did an RFI on. Really the impetus of this was to identify ways that we could partner with the private sector. I've been at Helion. I've seen the tremendous effort and work that's done there. I think it's in fact the piece that we need to connect the public program to support those activities, also in terms of making sure we're supporting the workforce that will be needed in order to support this incredible fusion technology development time.
Dr. White.
And just one last quick note for you, Senator. I think this is something where time is a really important factor to consider. While it might not be necessary to have some of these fusion materials, for example, to develop the very first or even second generation of fusion machines, they could be incredibly valuable as we think about wide-scale deployment and commercialization. But both the creation of these testing facilities and material testing will take time. So the sooner we start, the sooner we'll have these materials available, and we'll be able to have really serious conversations about wide-scale deployment and commercialization.
Great. Well, I burned my 7 minutes on one question, but I think that was very, actually
I think it
told
was
us a
worth it.
lot about where we need to go.
It was worth it.
Yeah.
Senator King. Senator King.
Can you tell he's the only engineer in the Senate?
Got another one at the end.
Oh,
Passed you.
How about you? There you go. Only 2 engineers in the Senate. I want to approach this from an entirely different perspective. We've talked a lot about competition with China. If this technology, when this technology becomes available, large-scale, commercial, it's literally world-changing. This is one of the most important topics we'll ever discuss around here. Probably the best thing we could do for the environment right now is to get China off of coal. What I'm leading up to is, why does this have to be a competition with China? This isn't a military technology. This is a civilian technology that's going to affect all the rest of us. Why can't this be a breakthrough in the relationship between our 2 countries where we work together? They're going to get there, and we're going to get there. Together, we might get there 5 years sooner. And clearly, we're already talking to our allies, but I don't see this as a military competition. Clearly, there are advantages to getting to this technology, but the advantages to the whole world, it seems to me, might be worth entering into some kind of discussion about whether this is an area where we don't have to compete, we can collaborate, and therefore drastically improve the prospects for saving the planet. Thoughts, Mr. White?
Great, thank you, Senator King. So I think this is a case where availability of clean energy around the world is absolutely critical. If we look to the pathway of trying to have clean energy for all parts of the world, we're going to need more energy sources than we could possibly imagine.
Right.
And having fusion energy alongside other firm clean energy sources, other variable clean energy sources is going to be key. So my first answer is the more competition, the better, because that means we have more shots on goal to actually get this technology working. And so I think there is a way to think about how competition breeds innovation and ultimately gets more smart people working on this topic, because it is something, as you said, that could be world-changing.
But if you've got a lot of smart people around the world working on it, it seems to me it would be good if they were talking to one another.
And I think you see that often in the scientific community. Where can you have collaboration on some of these key issues that really are cross-cutting questions? Going to the IAEA, going to international fusion conferences, you see conversations between scientists from around the world on the underlying science that they're doing. And I think that's where we can really try to identify international collaborations, international partnerships that really raise our level of understanding of a lot of these enabling science and technology questions that get us to fusion energy.
Do either of you have thoughts about this? I noticed you were nodding when I was talking. But that doesn't
Aggressively nodding over here, yes.
That doesn't go into the record, so.
Okay, thank you. Senator, thank you for that great question. I would love to see a world where we are all working aggressively together towards deploying an energy technology that, as Senator Manchin said earlier, could potentially bring about world peace. Right. The reality for us as a company right now is we see the real race here beginning after we actually demonstrate and deploy that first machine, where we're already watching China work aggressively to lock down that supply chain. And so for us, when we think about all the demand we're forecasting and already seeing from customers to deploy not only at scale here in the US, but around the world, we think it's a national security issue to ensure that here in the US and along with our allies, we can secure a supply chain that enables us to dominate this marketplace. Because if we don't, China will, and all of the geopolitical influence that accompanies that.
Which is exactly what they've done with EV batteries.
Precisely, that's right. We've seen this movie before, and I think we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity right now to avoid that same story.
Well, let me ask some specific questions about the technology. One is, I think one of you used the word affordable. One of the problems with the current nuclear fission plants is cost. Far more expensive than any other form of generation. Are there any, is it too early to have estimates? Will fusion be cheaper than fission?
I guess I'll take that very important question on first. I think the thing that we can really first think about is how do we talk about the cost of different energy generating technologies? Sometimes we might say, how much does one power plant cost versus another power plant? But we think as we move towards kind of a clean energy future, we need to think about overall system costs and what are the role that different energy generating assets are really playing. So it's not going, yes, but.
The relevant question
yes.
is cost per kilowatt hour to the consumer.
And and you're exactly right. And I think that's ultimately.
Nuclear is now pretty much at the top.
Nuclear is at the top, but one of the things that we see is that as it's integrated into a clean energy system, it helps bring down system costs because it reduces the amount of build out that you might need in some areas for renewables and storage. And so I think as we talk about the commercialization of fusion energy, economics is going to be an absolutely key point. How can they make sure that it can play an economically competitive role in the marketplace? And that's something that we'll see as these companies move through this technology development and demonstration.
I'm assuming your contract with Microsoft is, you're not going to tell us the price, but it's at a price that Microsoft feels is competitive with what they're paying now.
That's correct. So I can say that for the Microsoft agreement and the Nucor agreement, we're going to be at market rate or below. But what's really exciting about this, and I think we've heard the phrase holy grail mentioned a few different times here, is the ability to drive the cost down here. So I can say that for us at Helion, our machine is suited for mass manufacturing and it's built with factory components, which is very unlike the traditional fission
Is your
sector.
short answer that this should be less expensive than the current fleet of?
Significantly to the
Building
tune
a new
of
fission
potentially,
plant.
yes. So if we're able to mass produce this on the scale we envision, which could ultimately be building 1 generator a day, we could reduce costs down to 1 cent per kilowatt hour, which is truly world-changing.
I'm delighted to hear that, but I still remember when the predictions in the 50s for nuclear power was that it would be too cheap to
Too cheap to meter, yeah.
So go for it. And follow-up question, is there an advantage of this technology over SMRs?
There's a few. As I mentioned earlier, just the regulatory framework being fundamentally different.
I like your idea, by the way, about permitting a design. I like,
Yes.
you've got to have localized impact assessment,
That's
but
correct.
not go brand new on every plant.
Right, I think that's correct. I think when we really look at the details here, the fact that we can truly mass manufacture these machines and that they are built of primarily small factory components leads to a significant cost reduction when you compare it with traditional fission plants. I just want to say for the record too, I agree with Patrick, we need every low carbon or no carbon emissions technology we can get, right, to solve this problem. But yes, there are significant differences in cost when we look at deploying these at scale.
Final question, I think it was Senator Barrasso was asking about safety. Is fusion inherently a safer technology than fission? My colleague said yes, but he's not.
So I'll just say, I have worked in the fission space for many, many, many years and still am very excited about everything that's happening with small modular reactors and think we need this technology. But when we look at the material that we're using, the fuel that we're using for fusion versus what we see with fission, in fission it's something called special nuclear material. We're using uranium, which does have long-lived radioactive waste that accompanies it. And when you look at a fission reactor, you do have a higher risk, although it is very low, of having something like a runaway reaction, right, where we've seen incidents before. With fusion, we are not using special nuclear material. We're using, in our machine, deuterium or heavy water and helium-3. And these things, if you look at the periodic table, are at the opposite end of the periodic table from uranium. And it's the material that we use. That's where the real fundamental difference is when you look at what the safety case is.
Please.
So I think this is really a case where it will depend on the different machines that are developed, the different fuel cycles that are used, and ultimately the specific designs that ultimately determines the safety case of different fusion technologies. While I agree with many of the things that my fellow witness said, I think there are certain hazards that we're going to have to address with fusion energy. The tritium fuels that are going to be present in some of these fusion machines will have to be managed. They can be managed safely, but we'll need to manage them. And you can design facilities that are going to have different levels of risk depending on how they decide to design and optimize their systems.
Thank you.
Same things with some of the radioactive materials that might be produced as byproducts during operation from neutron irradiation. These are things that can be handled safely, but we need to make sure that we have both an emphasis in industry on design and optimization, and then a regulatory framework that ensures safety of these technologies.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr.
Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, to the chagrin of my staff, I'm going to digress for a second from some prepared questions to touch on a conversation that took place a minute ago between Senator King and Dr. White, because I think it's important to consider the context of this conversation. And I'm referring to the question of a specific energy technologies per unit cost versus the system cost. So my attempt at sort of a layman's explanation of that dynamic is this, where happily and aggressively pursuing expansions of solar technology and wind technology, et cetera. But I think the members of the committee and members of the Senate have become familiar with intermittency issues. So we can talk about wind versus solar versus other sorts of fossil fuels versus et cetera, but we're sensitive to what happens when the sun's not shining, what happens if the wind's not blowing, and the role of whether it's storage technologies or peaker plants or other things to make the system as a whole resilient, reliable, et cetera, while trying to minimize costs. So it's those interconnecting dynamics and factors that I think is the tension between an individual technologies per unit cost versus system cost, because we have holistic goals of reliability, cost containment, rates, impacts, et cetera. So that's my attempt at normalizing that exchange a few minutes ago. But on the subject at hand, as you all know, I'm proud to represent California, who we believe is the undisputed leader when it comes to fusion energy science. Besides having a large private startup ecosystem, California is also home to both the National Ignition Facility, the NIF at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, and the D3D at General Atomics in San Diego. NIF has been a tremendous success, and I think both the chair and the ranking member acknowledged that earlier in their comments, where they achieved fusion ignition 5 times in the last 2 years, less than 2 years. NIF experiments uniquely informed the foundational science of burning and ignited fusion plasmas needed for fusion energy. And additionally, D3D is about to celebrate its 200,000th experiment and has also been instrumental in fusion R&D. So with sustained funding for operations as well as refurbishment and plant upgrades, these fusion facilities will continue to provide the U.S. a singular advantage in advancing fusion energy. My question is for Dr. Olan. How can we capitalize on this progress to develop a timeline for achieving commercial fusion and maintain this momentum? I think the question of timeline has come up before, but let's be clear in our objective here, not just clear in additional successful demonstrations, scaling up, but bringing it to commercialization.
Yeah, thank you, Senator Padilla, for that question. And as a proud alum of Cal Poly Pomona, I'm glad that you mentioned California and very much, yeah, the point about the relevance of leveraging existing assets is that it's not just, as you pointed out, ecosystems where we have in fact benefited tremendously from being able, for example, to benchmark a lot of the advanced modeling codes, that tools that in fact we're utilizing to be able to design the future fusion energy systems that would come in the private sector. But I think one important point about the objective of these investments is it's clear that we have to now move from the science alone questions to now the technology focused questions. And to do that, the bridges of the public and private sectors, the public program also has to make sure that it's aligned. And part of, in my comments, what I shared was this public-private consortium frameworks approach, where we're looking at not just the labs that are engaging and taking advantage of these tools and assets and universities, but also have partnerships with local and state governments and, in fact, other investment participants to be able to then identify where is the near-term infrastructure that we have to invest. This is part of our conversation right now. In fact, I have daily conversations with the private sector about the possibilities of partnerships. And this is an aspect, in fact, in the Building Bridges vision that I laid out earlier this year to ensure that we're converging the both the public and private, both the interests and also priorities that have to be aligned. The Fusion Science and Technology Roadmap that we unveiled this year, or at least that we unveiled the plan towards that roadmap, is precisely to your point, Senator, is looking at targeting with metrics, input from the industry, how much progress are we making every year? And that's a question that we'll be asking every investment we make in our program.
Follow-up question for Ms. Stevens, actually, because I appreciated your remarks earlier about it's not just the breakthrough technologies and successful demonstrations once or twice, but when we get to the point of scaling up and commercialization, looking at the supply chain, strategic positioning and investments that we should be thinking about today. Can you have any thoughts or comments on that not just coordination, collaboration between the public and private sector, but what the right balance is and what we should be doing?
Yes, thank you for that question, Senator. And I'll just start by saying that Helion, we are delighted to have Dr. Alon in the position that he is in at Department of Energy. It's been really exciting to see, really for the first time ever, the conversations about how to support commercialization taking place and really more focus on partnerships with industry. I'm going to focus on the supply chain piece of the question here for just a minute, because I do feel like there are sectors of our government that have never been activated to support fusion before, and that now is the moment to quickly and thoughtfully put together a plan to do so. I think in large part, when we think about how to support a supply chain for a fusion industry, it's about activating existing programs and existing funding. I think ultimately we will need to look at new programs, but in the near term, we can look at particularly Department of Commerce, thinking about how can we activate chips to support building out a domestic supply chain of chips specific to fusion. That would be huge for us as a company, because we use thousands of them for one machine. Also, at our company right now, our headquarters, we've built in-house a capacitor manufacturing capacity, because we need to actually have around 15% of the capacitors we need for our 7th prototype built in-house to meet the demand, to meet the need. Otherwise, we would be even more reliant on China than we want to be. So I think that there's a lot we can do with the Department of Commerce and other agencies to think about that supply chain problem and do it now, so that when we hit that benchmark of electricity production, we have a plan to pick up and move quickly with.
All right. And, well, my time is up. Maybe as a follow-up to today's hearing, I would love to pick each of your brains also, not just on the workforce question, thinking ahead, but where our colleges and university systems are to prepare, educate, train that workforce that we will need when the time comes. Thank you, Mr.
Let me say one thing before I go on to the next speaker, and I think Senator King has really led the charge on this, and we have it into our permitting bill, is reconducting. Reconducting basically the capacity on the lines. This will double the amount of electrons that can be carried without building anything. But I know that maybe the utilities aren't crazy about it because they can't have the capital expenditure to charge more higher rates. This would be the way for us to get into the game quicker, to put more electrons on, to have more capacity for you all. So this is in our permitting bill, and it would really, really accelerate what we need to do in our country. Senator Cortez Masto.
And you even had a prop. That was good. I like it. Let me continue on the supply chain build out, because I think this is crucial as part of us maintaining an economic advantage here. My understanding is the high performance magnets are crucial for fusion energy, and China controls, what, 90% of our global rare earth mineral processing and rare earth magnet manufacturing. Last year, China announced an export ban of rare earth extraction and separation technologies. Between this action and its recent export ban on other minerals like graphite, gallium, germanium, it's clear they're threatening to weaponize this area, right? And so what steps can we do to secure that supply chain? We've talked a little bit about it, but I want to kind of get very specific and just throw this out here. You know, Senator Mullen and I, we introduced the Rare Earth Magnet Manufacturing Production Tax Credit Act to incentivize more of this manufacturing and bring those supply chains back here. Similar to what we did with solar, geothermal, all of the above, to give opportunities for bringing the manufacturing back here. Does that make sense? Should we be doing things like that in Congress or other things to incentivize building out that chain that we need here to protect?
Thank you for that question. We talk about this a lot every day at Helion as we look to build out that supply chain. For us, we are mainly thinking about right now our biggest pain points being the production of those high voltage capacitors and the semiconductors for our machines. Okay. One thing that would be transformational for us would be to actually amend the 45X manufacturing tax credit to make sure that fusion is eligible. Fusion supply chain pieces are eligible for that. Would love to talk with you more about other things we can be doing, but it's when we think about existing programs, existing incentives that simply need to be activated for fusion, this is a really good example.
Okay. Dr. White.
Thank you. Yeah, I think building on that last comment, really this idea of having technology-inclusive policies that incorporate the fusion energy supply chain into the broader clean energy supply chain are critical. There are a wide variety of different engineering concepts currently underway for fusion energy. Some may require high-performance capacitors and other electronics. Some may require high-temperature superconducting magnets. Some may require laser technology. And so trying to focus on any one technology may make the process of trying to build an entire industry challenging. But if we can make sure that the policies that are out there to enable either tax credits, production incentives, other types of benefits for any fusion energy technology, I think is a really easy way to help the entire space flourish and really allow companies to explore maybe other novel, innovative technologies that otherwise wouldn't be covered under any specific umbrella of one tax credit.
That's helpful. Dr. Ling.
Yes, thank you, Senator. I think another aspect of this is in the supply chain also is innovation. And that's why in my remarks I talked about building a robust fusion technology manufacturing network. And the reason why I brought up that point is we have to make sure that the bridges that we build with public and private are not only in developing those energy systems, that's an important part, but it's also supporting the growth of that supply chain that you indicated, Senator. And to that, the international partnerships with like-minded nations is really, really important because this is the place where we're seeing, for example, right now, companies that are coming from abroad to come here to the United States and even US-based companies that are finding an opportunity in the manufacturing sector and regional hubs all across this country, all across the United States. The program needs to make sure that we are supporting the growth of those interests by ensuring that as we think about fusion, science, and technology, the technology aspects of it is prioritizing on a lot of what's been mentioned already, right? Advanced materials. If you look, for example, forward-looking at what are some of these technologies that need, some closure of gaps, we find that the bridge also to the private sector and those industrials, let's say, that are providing supply chain, that's an aspect that we have to pay attention now. Not wait while the fusion developers are ready to put energy on the grid, but right now be able to do this in this timeline.
Yeah, and I agree. I think we just need to be very strategic about what we are trying to achieve now, but also 5, 10 years down the road, what we need, because we have to start working on it now. For that reason. The other thing I want to touch on, and Senator King and I have this conversation all the time, nuclear waste, right? Yucca Mountain, I'm from Nevada, I'll just put it out there.
She's against Yucca Mountain.
I'm against Yucca Mountain. But here's why, but I'm not against fusion, and here's why I think it's important for us to start educating the general public. This idea, the difference between fission and fusion and the waste material. Because besides having an economic impact that we're having for society, but there's a societal impact, right, between the two. And there's a difference about the environment and the impact to the environment. So I don't know who would want to touch on it, Dr. Lane, but can you talk about the difference between the two and the waste material, the difference, and how we as a Congress should also be looking at the societal impacts?
Yes, thank you, Senator, for that question. And let me speak from the context of what I believe is one of the key issues on waste streams for any technology that's not only energy dense, but in this particular case, we're talking about, you referred to fission and fusion, and these are indeed, quite different in terms of how we have to manage waste streams. And what I would like to focus on is that in terms of waste streams for fusion, I believe that there's a lot in that aspect where it's going to take innovation around fusion materials. How you design these materials, how you think about the way the materials are responding to, of course, earlier was mentioned, we are generating neutrons. They're going to be activating, and even though it's low-level waste, we still have to be very, very cognizant of how to manage it. I think it's a terrific opportunity for a lot, in fact, of our performers. In fact, a lot of the expertise around fusion materials, we have over 4 decades of leadership in this space that we can leverage. And in fact, be able to, in speaking about supply chains, take advantage of this as an opportunity for the United States and being able to manage this waste stream properly. Yes.
Well, and let me just say, and I hope that's the case. I hope there is this collaboration with Congress and our brilliant minds, our scientists, around this and the future and how we manage the waste. Because Congress was not successful back in 1982 and still to this day dealing with some of the nuclear waste that is out there. So there has to be this collaboration, and I'm just hoping my colleagues, we come to the table and we work with all of you to do that.
I just want to give sort of a very specific example for our company at Helion, because this really stood out to me and sort of amazed me, coming from the fission space, looking at our fuel cycle and our waste streams. So as I mentioned earlier, we use deuterium, which is heavy water, and helium-3 as our fuel. Tritium's half-life is only 12.3 years, and that's compared to around 24,000 years for fission waste. So when you think about something like we never want to say this word, but yucca, right? When we think about something like that, the reason that's necessary is because of those 24,000 years you have to think about managing this. So that's a huge shift when you talk about 12.3 years. And the best thing for us as a company is that the tritium that's a byproduct of our process is actually a commodity for us, because in about 12.5 years, it actually decays into helium-3, which is one of our fuels. So when we think about our fuel cycle as a company, it's the most sustainable I've ever seen.
Thank you. Yeah, Dr. White.
I think really when we talk about the difference between fission waste and fusion waste, the number one characteristic with fusion is that we will not have the spent nuclear fuel. And that's the kind of waste that was ultimately destined for Yucca Mountain. But I think as we think about different fusion technologies, there will be other waste produced during operation. And so I think one thing that's going to be very important for the private fusion industry and collaborators around the world to really think about is what are the disposal pathways for that waste? Trying to understand what type of waste will be produced. How can we minimize those through operation? How can we think about things like material recycling to maybe reduce or reuse some of the materials that are coming from fusion machines for future machines? And then how are ways that we can potentially process and package waste for disposal? We already have a lot of facilities around the United States that can handle essentially nuclear waste that is not spent nuclear fuel. And these are facilities that are already capable of handling what we call in the industry Class A, Class B, Class C waste, different ways of classifying material that is contaminated with radioactive material. The question will be, as we think about scaling up a commercial fusion industry, how can they make choices on advanced materials, on the way they're operating the machines, on the way they're maintaining their machines, and on their entire maintenance and decommissioning strategy to make sure that fusion waste is not a burden and is not a barrier for fusion energy moving forward. And I think that's going to be a really exciting, innovative place over the next few years as we think about commercializing the industry.
Senator, the only thing I would say about Yucca Mountain, they could have picked a better name, but the Yucca plant, I understand that. They could have figured something out. Anyway, with that being said, we're going to go to Senator Cassidy.
Thank you all. Dr. Lane, I'm from Louisiana. I have a lot of petrochemical refineries. They have a real interest in decarbonization. And I gather that some of the industry in my state are actually, Dow and I think Air Liquide, are looking at fusion as a way to decarbonize. Any comment upon that? If somebody was watching from back home, speak to that, please.
Thank you, Senator, for the question. So, we have a number of different private sector, entities that are pursuing fusion in different ways and different approaches to fusion energy. I think what's exciting right now is what you're seeing is the beginning of convergence between the public and private sector, which is enabling for us to be able to leverage the public sector know-how and expertise to be able to truly accelerate our pace towards fusion energy. Now, of course, as you talk about timelines, I mentioned this in my remarks earlier. For us to reach fusion energy at a decadal time frame, we do have to close out the remainder science and technology gaps that do exist. There are aspects of the technology, for instance, that the private sector is aggressively going after, and in fact, there are designs and prototypes that are being built at a rate of 1.5 to 2 years, which is an incredible pace. To see that in the private sector. And so I see that the question in terms of the timeline is one where as long as we can build that bridge between the public and private, we're going to be able to get the expertise needed on some of the outstanding gaps that are needed for us to get there in a decadal time.
By the way, your name would fit right at home in Louisiana.
I know. Alain, it's a French name, yes.
Alain and Jean-Paul, you know what I'm saying?
Right. That's right. Thank you very much for pronouncing it like that.
So we are talking about USG investment. But I'm hearing from you that there's significant private investment. And everybody's nodding their head. So to what degree is that private investment supplanting or at least augmenting? Again, if we're looking at how do we invest, we want to do it wisely.
Yeah, right.
And so to what degree is that private investment, that private public, I mean, Dow really wants to do this, Air Liquide really wants to do this, et cetera. Can we take that into account to say, well, wait a second, in competing priorities, we know private sector is really stepping up, that sort of thing.
Let me maybe answer this question this way, Senator, and I think this is a great question that, I'd like my colleagues here also to address. It's a question of being very thoughtful, methodical, and strategic as to how those investments are made. The questions we're asking right now in our public programs precisely this. In a dialogue with the private sector, where are the common gaps that many of, for example, our private sector companies are in fact stepping up and saying, here's a common gap that right now our investments are very much focused on the development of our technology specifically, but there are common gaps that we need help. And this is where the government's coming in very aggressively to say, look, let's look at our program, let's make sure we're realigned towards those gaps and make sure we aggressively invest
So
in
there's
them.
some concern that China might be spending more on this, but that would be CCP / they are China Inc. Okay, my understanding is that there is no public-private, it is China Inc. Yeah. Whereas in our case, we're speaking about USG, but we are also having public investment, and then I know that we're part of that French initiative in which there's other countries that are there. Yeah. So put that all together, and how much should we be concerned that China Inc. is spending more than we, as opposed to no, if you put it all together, we're hitting it right.
Yeah, this is a great question. There is a significant investment needed to translate fusion technology. There's no question about that, right?
Because the private sector is helping to translate, right?
That's right. But the question is more of how you prioritize those investments, right? And the key piece here is, again, making sure we take advantage of that public and private exchange and connection. This is what.
But my question, I get that.
Okay.
My question is, if X amount of money is spent, and let's assume that we're actually wise and we use our federal dollars to fill in the gap between what the private sector is doing. Sure. And we know that we're part of this multinational initiative in France, which we all share the technology. Mm-hmm. I think we want to know how to prioritize our spending.
Sure.
We don't want to fall behind. But wait a second, no, between the private sector and our international partners, plus what we're doing okay. Yeah. No one ever says we're doing okay. Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
I think this is a fantastic topic to bring up, because I'll say that what matters the most for us right now when you talk specifically about a race with China is the amount of money that China is spending on commercially relevant programs, right? And so for us, I can speak for Helion specifically, we're looking at the race that begins after we demonstrate, and that's building out the supply chain here in the United States and with our allies to make sure we can deploy at scale to actually win this race with China. But also looking at how we can utilize the funding that already exists within the Department of Energy to focus more on applied material research and development. Again, commercially relevant R&D that's going to help these machines that we're trying to deploy now. And Fusion Industry Association has done some fantastic work on actually breaking down what the spending looks like.
So I think what I'm hearing from you is that it's not only that, of course, everybody always wants more money authorized.
Right.
And everybody always wants more appropriated.
Yes.
But our oversight could also be directed towards making sure that the money is spent wisely.
Precisely. I think that we certainly, as you say, more money is always nice. But yes, I think that there are ways that we could better strategically utilize what we already have. Yes.
Sir?
Great, thanks, Senator. I think another really important thing to think about when it comes to federal funding and the private fusion industry is really the multiplicative effect of federal investment into private fusion companies. Early stage grants can help take innovative fusion concepts that otherwise might struggle in private markets and help them get to the level of demonstration where they can go out and actually get VC funding for their ideas, or help them demonstrate early stage technologies that then can enter into the National Lab Program for other grants. And also getting a grant from a DOE program like the DOE's Milestone Program for Fusion can have a huge impact on companies to really give private investors some confidence that the experts at DOE have looked at this technology, they think there's something there worth investing in, so it can have a huge impact in helping to bring even more private capital, I think, into the private fusion space.
So you're adding nuance to what Dr. Alon said, is that it'll put a little French inflection on it. Dr. Alon said, in terms of doing the common gap, and what Ms. Sieben said, okay, we've got to commercialize, and you're putting a little bit more of a drill down. Here's a specific place to plant that seed corn more effectively.
Exactly, Senator. And I think the other thing is really identifying those cross-cutting issues like materials research, like fusion fuel cycle, like tritium handling, these things that are going to be needed for almost every company in the fusion sector that might be too large of a lift for any one company to do alone. But if we can really use
But
the
I'm sorry, one
Yeah.
more question. But we have this international consortium that is doing it in France. I assume that they're all doing this sort of thing. Do we need to reinvent that?
So the International Consortium is really going to be focused on scientific demonstration of kind of a net fusion energy machine. It very much is a scientific demonstration device. It might not necessarily go as far into some of the advanced materials research and commercially relevant technology development that were needed.
If I may add to this point, Senator, to realize fusion energy, it's going to take multiple actions in parallel, not just, for example, that particular consortium you're talking about, but multiple ways for us to leverage international partnerships. This is why in our international partnership plan and strategy for the U.S., we're engaging like-minded nations to, in fact, address the very topics that we just talked about, but do it in a way where we can invest together and basically make sure that we're multiplying the resources that we already have.
Got it. Thank you very much for your forbearance, Mr. Chair. I yield.
Thank you. And Senator Hickenlooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank all of you for your work, for being here today. But
Turn your speaker on.
I turned it on.
Now it's on. Well, speak into it then.
He's obviously in a finicky mood.
He's my dear friend. I can speak to him that way.
Dr. Elaine, recently DOE funded 3 laser fusion research hubs, $42 million over 4 years, to bring together researchers from academia, national laboratories, from industry, to begin to address a lot of the technical challenges that are being discussed already to this path for commercializing fusion. Colorado State University is breaking ground soon on a $150 million facility that will house 3 very high-power lasers, and this will be obviously a unique facility, but really trying to build on those public-private partnerships. How will DOE work with Colorado State University to help commercialize this process?
Yeah, thank you very much, Senator, for that question. A little over a year ago, in fact, I was in the state of Colorado celebrating our IFE hubs with the community of over 500 scientists and engineers. Very excited about the prospects of these new programs that we've established in FES. So, as I mentioned earlier, I think the bridge between public and private the public and private sectors is key for us to be able to advance and support commercialization. Inertial fusion energy is one example of this, of what we're doing today. Historically, of course, as you know, with the facilities in NIF at Livermore, the NNSA has a very specific mission, right? And we've seen that we've been able to leverage all the great strides that have been made in that science to now really focus on the engineering of realizing fusion, in this case, from inertial fusion energy sources. Part of the activity now with these hubs is, in fact, to identify, as we mentioned earlier, these common gaps that are coming up. We keep talking about things like materials and fuel cycle, et cetera. The activity that's happening in Colorado State is also reflecting on this other message that I talked about, which is the engagement of state-level government, local and state governments, academia, national labs, and the federal government. This partnership with the private sector, in this case Marvel Fusion and some of the other actors there in Colorado, is just another example of what's happening here in the United States, is that we're seeing this catalyst of investments that are really driving the move towards from just science-centric questions more to technology development. So it's very exciting.
Right, and I think we can argue that process of that high-level integration and collaboration is very different than what happens in China, our rival.
And I will add also, Senator, that that activity in Colorado is uniquely tied right now with another like-minded nation partner of ours in Germany.
Right.
We were just there last month. We took a U.S. delegation of 10 scientists and engineers there that represented basically the whole landscape from our program. because we're really focused on making sure we identify the ecosystems that will support not just the science, but the technology development. In fact, the supply chains related to laser systems, a lot of the components, that go into development of these high-power lasers, that was the central piece of our discussions and our partnership with Germany.
Yeah, and you're right. That's just an added dimension that goes beyond the rivalry of what China has. Ms. Stevens, let me ask you a question. In this critical race with China, sometimes I wonder what we would do without China. Where would we get the sense of urgency that is usually necessary to these kinds of achievements? But we are in a critical race in this great transition, global energy to a cleaner future. And fusion really does have the potential to revolutionize this in so many different ways, and especially as we get towards affordability. It enhances not just environmental safety, but security increases. And yet, by some measures, we are still falling behind China, as you guys have pointed out. So can you elaborate a little more in detail on some of the investments China's making in fusion, and how Congress and the administration can take steps to regain the advantage?
Thank you for the question, Senator. So I'll start with two very specific examples that Helion has been watching closely. The first is that Helion Energy Research Institute's Helion experiment announced a program pretty much right after we announced that our last machine, Trenta, had reached 100 million degree temperatures. And they actually published a schematic that was identical to Helion's concept. So they're not shy about this, right? Another example is China's HH Max recently acknowledged Helion's approach as the fastest to commercial power, and then publicly stated its intent to replicate our design. So again, not shy about it right out front. But the other piece that I want to keep coming back to really hone in on is, once again, on that supply chain. They have a track record of success in really locking down supply chains for things that we innovate here and really demonstrate first in the United States. And so I think that is a very important area that we need to be thinking about now and working together to put together a policy framework that we can really kick off quickly after we demonstrate, so that we can make sure that we aren't relying so heavily on China as we move to scale.
Yeah, Dr. White.
Yeah, Senator Hickenlooper, if I can just provide a little bit of additional context. I think it's important, if we think about those different phases of technology development, what does it mean for a scientific demonstration, an engineering demonstration, commercial demonstration? China has a plan for each one of those phases. The BEST tokamak, which is the burning plasma experimental superconducting tokamak that they call BEST, is currently under construction in China, and that will serve as both a scientific and engineering demonstration for their technology. And they've already announced plans for their China Fusion Engineering Test Reactor, or CFETR, that is essentially going to be a demonstration fusion machine. In addition to that, they have their CRAFT facility, which is kind of a cross-cutting technology R&D facility that's going to address many of the material science, enabling technologies, and fusion fuel cycle issues that are really cross-cutting for all technology concepts. So it's really seen that they have a plan for scientific demonstration, engineering demonstration, and commercial demonstration at a federal level as part of a plan.
Right.
And so that's, I think, what we're really trying to compete against and make sure that we have a matching plan to get to commercialization.
I agree, and that's where our collaboration gets a little bit, makes that more of a challenge. Anyway, I appreciate the supply chains. We see the same thing in critical minerals, that they are building supply chains that are more cohesive and become the determinative. They make it harder for us to build our supply chain.
Senator Murkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good discussion this morning. Thank you all for being here today. We're talking collaboration, we're talking partnerships, and these are key. These are great. They're all important. Really an essential part of driving our nation's success and leadership in so many of these emerging technologies. But now let's talk about China and how it fits into the picture to make sure that we have appropriate safeguards that are in place while we engage in these partnerships. And the ITER project has been referenced. The fusion facility in south of France gets support from a number of nations, including China. So as we are participating in this, contributing funds, the research, the hardware components, how are the U.S. technologies and the resources being safeguarded against program partners that may be adversarial to certain of our interests? How do you manage that aspect of it? And I think this is to you, Dr. Elaine.
Yeah, thank you so much, Senator, for the question. And indeed, as mentioned already earlier, it is important not only to be, not only to safeguard, in fact, the innovation and know-how and expertise of our performers, but make sure that we have instrument and elements for us to be able to safeguard that. The reference to ITER is that it's an international project that indeed is engaging 7 nations, 7 countries. The way that we've worked towards this is, the focus is all on the in-kind hardware and contributions that we provide that project. That's one aspect of it, right? And the nature of the, let's say, the contracts that go in terms of that hardware and in terms of the know-how behind that, of course, is IP that is protected. There are aspects, of course, of ITER, since it is still and remains a scientific project, that is open. For example, there are aspects, for instance, in terms of know-how or technical expertise that could be shared. And that's all under a very specific agreement between, of course, those that are engaging the project, in this case, the ITER organization, and those contracts and the language around those contracts. But I can tell you and assure you that the aspect that has to do, for example, with the impact on U.S. side supply chains, that's very much protected by, again, agreements that protect the IP of those that are engaging in delivering the in-kind hardware to this project, and also as well those that may be interested in accessing that information. It's not information that is readily available unless they're going through a very specific step and process to access that data and that information.
You feel relatively comfortable in the safeguards. Let me ask you, Ms. Siebens, because your testimony highlights China's efforts to replicate some of Helion's own prototypes. And as you are aware of this, can you share if they have been successful in engineering their own versions of these technologies based off this information?
Thank you for the question, Senator. As of this time, I do not believe that is true, but they are working very hard to try and replicate. One thing I can say is that when we think about how do we protect our IP as a private company, one of the ways we do that is by focusing on building and demonstrating a machine versus sort of writing about what we're doing and sharing it on a constant basis, right? And I think this has been sort of a paradigm shift that we've seen happen in the fusion ecosystem after really just the past 10 years, where predominantly this has been a science taking place in academia and in an environment where it is absolutely the culture to share across country boundaries and really have this be collective efforts. Whereas now that we're shifting to this is very near term and we're bringing something to the grid soon, that's where you sort of shift into a place where we're going to be nose to the grindstone focused on actually demonstrating this and not necessarily sharing everything that we're working on. Yeah.
So let me ask about that, because that's where I see things with excitement. It's been talked about how fusion can make a difference when we're looking at increased energy demands. We've talked about clean power to areas like manufacturing, mineral processing, data centers. We all see that. Can any of you share with me what you think the potential is to address energy and reliability challenges when we're in remote and very rural areas? Obviously, I come from a state where we're very challenged with how we're able to provide for energy resources in remote places, say, for instance, a mine that's out in literally the middle of most nowhere. Can you speak to that? Dr. White?
Great, thank you, Senator Murkowski. So I think this is where we start talking about how to set up that clean energy grid of the future, especially in remote locations. How do we think about balancing the intermittent or the variable renewable sources that are there, storage, and then firm clean energy? And I think fusion energy has the potential to be a very effective firm clean energy source that can help power those communities. The question will really end up becoming, how do private companies develop machines of different sizes, of different capabilities that match up with the needs for those different customers? What does it mean to provide heat and electricity to a small community versus trying to provide and meet the energy needs for a large industrial user like a mine? And so I think this is an opportunity for the private industry to really work with different stakeholders and different potential customers like those in Alaska to really identify what are the energy products they should be prioritizing and they should be working on. In some cases, we may want a fusion machine that produces 500 megawatts of electricity and can power 500,000 homes. Sometimes you might want one that can power 5 megawatts and really meet the needs of a small community. And I think that's something that we're seeing the private fusion industry really try to identify and develop.
So, Helion, let's use you as an example here. Would Helion look at opportunities to demonstrate certain technology in specific areas in Alaska, and what would you be looking for in terms of being able to cite something?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question, Senator. So our machines, our systems are very well suited for siting in remote communities, and there's a couple reasons for that. The first is that we have a very small external power demand. So we have a pulsed system. That's what we use in our machine. And all we need external power for is to draw in and create that first pulse before we sort of keep that machine running. And that is not a lot of power. We could actually use solar panels on the roof of one of our buildings to kickstart that, or a small generator that's attached to the building. The other thing to mention is the actual small footprint of our facility. So for a 50 megawatt plant, you're looking at around under 30,000 square feet for the entire facility. And that's about the size of a football field. So small community, small.
15 or 50?
50 megawatt.
50 megawatt.
And then the other thing is 24/7 power. So you've got that consistent, reliable electricity. And the actual fuel that we use is, again, very small amounts that we actually need on site. So we wouldn't need a lot of land for extra fuel storage either. So I think we're very well suited and very interested in looking at applications in Alaska.
Good, very interesting. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Hoeven.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Where's your sidekick today?
He knew you were coming.
Scared him off? Well, when Senator Murkowski leaves, that means I'm the ranking Republican.
You can take over.
We could
be
do
chairman if you want.
Maybe we could do some serious business.
We're just so happy to have you.
You're a good man. Thanks to all of you for being here. I guess my question is, we talk about fusion being the energy source of the future. What's to say it's not always going to be the energy source of the future, right? You've heard that before, meaning, gee whiz, it seems to be a long time in coming. I mean, I can remember as a little kid, my dad talking about fusion being better than fission, and, reading stories about the super collider and the effort in Texas, and, this has been going on for a long time. So I guess my question is, is it really going to happen? When's it going to show up? Is it commercially? And is it going to show up in these smaller applications or the larger applications? And you all get a shot at this one in any order you want.
All right, thank you, Senator, for the question. And of course, I'm sure there's going to be very good answers for this one. We have to remember that many of the major novel technologies that we live in today took a long time to get there and translate. I mean, this is a reality. I will say that what's wonderful, what's happening today, as opposed to even just 10 years ago, you can go to, Devens, Massachusetts, or go over to Everett, Everett, Washington, and watch what is happening in the private sector. It's a daily grind, it's a daily race, if you will, in building prototypes towards fusion energy demonstration. That's exciting. Our program, in fact, now that, I'm in this position now for a little bit over a year ago, as a material scientist and engineer myself, a nuclear engineer, it's also exciting to see the fact that in our program, we're also trying to really rethink how we're thinking about fusion. And you're right, it's always been this 20 to 30-year outlook on when is fusion going to be ready. What gives me confidence and comfort, actually, in seeing is all of the technology developments outside fusion that's impacting fusion energy development today. I mentioned earlier AI/ML. There are advances, for example, in high temperature materials also that we're taking advantage of. So what you're seeing, Senator, is a convergence of a lot of these technologies that's helping accelerate many of the approaches that we're seeing the over $7 billion investment in the private sector realize.
So that means we're going to be actually using it in a commercially viable way when? Next year? 2 years? 5 years?
So the timeline I think that we're really focused on right now is making sure that the science and tech gaps that we do have on some of these approaches are addressed right now, right? In a decadal time frame, that's been the focus. We're looking at, in the 2030s for us to be able to see those fusion pilot plants, which are demonstrating that all of the integration of these technologies that are on the path towards realizing, let's say, electricity on the grid. But there's some approaches, in fact, that can get there even faster. And I will go ahead and yield the time here.
But when you say the 30s, that still sounds like, oh, we're 10 years away.
Well, again, so the question is technology development and translation. It does take time, right? And so the question is, in your question is alluding to what time scale that is.
I'm not alluding to it. I want you to tell me specifically
Yeah.
when we're going to be using fusion. Because that's the same answer you could have given 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago.
What I can tell you is in the last decade, we've made significant strides to be able to close a lot of these science.
You're still not telling me that within 5 years, we are going to have a commercially viable pilot project, and it's going to look like this. That's what I'm asking. And if you can tell me that, I understand, but that's the specific question I'm asking.
Sure.
Because your answer could have been given, we could have been sitting here 10 years ago, and you could have given that answer.
Yeah. No, I appreciate the question, Senator. I think the answer, at least the way I would like to respond to this, is the fact that we are making strides in being able to close those gaps. And we see that in the next half decade to decade.
Yeah.
I'd love to give you a very precise answer to this question. We are on track to have the first ever commercially operating fusion plant in 2028, providing power to Microsoft. We have a firm power purchase agreement with Microsoft.
What's that going to look like?
What's it going to look like? So for us, the actual fusion machine itself is something called a pulse system, and I'm happy to go after hearing and dive in all the tech weeds on that, but essentially it's a machine.
Explain, if you will.
Yeah.
The magnet that we've seen in ITER and versus the pulse system, it might help Senator Hoeven, help me too.
How we're different?
Different. The pulse different from what the ITER demonstration
I love talking about this, yes. So back in the 40s and 50s, when fusion was really emerging as a concept, pulse concepts were actually already under consideration back then, along with the tokamak design, which is what you're seeing out in ITER. And so the main difference here is that you have a steady state design, which is what ITER is, where you're trying to actually contain long-lived plasmas, so that needs to be contained for a long period, whereas a pulsed system is actually saying, no, let's actually just do small amounts of fusion in very quick increments repeatedly. And so that's really the difference. And it helps reduce the size of the machine significantly.
Does the pulse, I'm so sorry.
No, I'm good with as long as you are. No,
I just want to know, does the pulse able to ramp up, ramp down, basically?
Yes.
More so because ITER, when she's produced, it's got to produce.
Yes, so precisely. So for our machine, we could pulse 1 time every minute. We could pulse 10 times per second.
So basically, you could operate on the demand.
Yes, and we can do that in real time. So it doesn't take long for us to
You've already
ramp up.
perfected that technology.
So yes, so with our last prototype that we called Trenta, we had over 10,000 fusion pulses with that machine. And that's really what's given us the confidence that we're going to be able to demonstrate electricity production with our 7th machine, which is on track to be completed this year.
So when you say 28, are you talking about a pulse system?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That's correct.
So, but keep going now.
Yes. Okay.
I know the chairman is going to give me a little more time now because it's a collaborative.
Yes.
This has turned into a collaborative process.
I was going to commend you on a great question.
Yeah, which I think is really good. Because you said 28. Good for you. Now, it may happen, it might not happen, but at least it starts to give us a feel, okay, we can look towards something. Now we want to know what you think it's going to, so you're thinking 28.
Yes.
And we want to know what it looks like.
Right.
So just elaborate a little more on what this
looks like.
Right, so for the actual.
And I mean, what, what it looks like in terms of how it works and what it's going to do.
Sure.
Like it's going to run some guy's lawnmower or whatever.
Right. So in this instance, we're thinking about the power needs of Microsoft, our customer, largely for data centers. And this first plant's going to be 50 megawatts. And the footprint of the facility will be approximately the size of a football field, just under 30,000 square feet. And that is the full perimeter of the site. And when we turn the machine on, we will be able to, as Senator Manchin alluded to, we will be able to actually ramp up or down depending on what the needs are for our customer.
Wow.
And then ultimately, we also have an agreement with Nucor, the largest steel producer in North America, to deploy a 500 megawatt facility.
Okay, but before you get beyond, okay, you're talking, so a facility the size of a football field, it's a 50 megawatt.
Correct.
And you can ramp up and down how much of that megawattage you provide, so it's variable.
Correct.
And once you've built it, does it just run, is it like nuclear fission where it essentially, you don't have that ongoing fuel cost? I mean, it costs beaucoup to build the thing, right? We get that. But at that point then, does that sucker just, run until Manchin's like 250 years old, or,
So we will need
you know what I
to,
mean?
yes.
And that's the promise of this stuff, is that you
Right.
put it in a spaceship, and you go to, Neptune and back, and you never need to refuel it.
Right. So
Right?
we do have, so because it's a pulse system, and with any system, you're still going to eventually add more fuel to the system. For us, we're puffing our fuel, the deuterium, the heavy water, and the helium-3 into either side of our machine.
Well, but that's part of my question is,
Yeah.
do you have to keep refueling? Because the promise of this
Right.
is that it powers forever, basically, once you build it.
Right.
So that's my question.
For us, yes, we do need more fuel to.
And that would be
continue
what?
it. But, so for us, it's the deuterium heavy water, very cheap. And helium-3, which is kind of funny, it's not widely available naturally on Earth, so we get some pretty crazy questions about folks that want to go mine the moon for us. But actually, we can create helium-3 right here.
But see, this part of the question really matters, because otherwise you might as well be putting gasoline or something else if you have to keep refueling, right? That diminishes the applications that we're trying to develop this for. For example, a rocket ship that will fly all over, to
Right.
galaxies beyond,
So I don't actually see it as a challenge when it comes to our fuel, and there's a couple reasons why. It is widely abundant and very cheap. So deuterium, for example, I'm holding some right here. So it's heavy water. You could even drink it if you want to. I don't really want to, but you could. And so the reason I mention this is because water is readily available and abundant on planet Earth, and we don't see any time frame in the future where we run out.
So when you say heavy water, it's kind of like, it's available almost like water.
Yeah, precisely, that's
Okay,
right. And then for the helium-3, actually, helium-3 is a byproduct, first of all, of our fusion system. And so we're actually creating more of the fuel we need just by running our machine. We can also create a separate machine that is just deuterium and deuterium fusing, and the byproduct of that is helium-3. So all of this is very cheap and provides a very sustainable fuel.
So fission has the problem of the byproduct, that you create nuclear radioactive material, and
Correct.
what the hell do we do with it, right? If you can't completely reprocess it, nobody wants to store it, right? We think Yucca Mountain is a great example. But the nice thing about it is if you have it in your nuclear carrier, you drive all over the world for a long, long time, and you don't have to refuel anywhere, nor do you have to carry any fuel, right? That would be an advantage of fission over fusion. So again, as you develop this new energy source, for folks that are more in the common sense lane, because they weren't good enough in math to be an engineer or a scientist, like me, I'm trying to understand, okay, why is it we're spending a lot of money on this thing? When are we going to see a benefit? And how is that going to be more beneficial than other energy sources? And that's why what you're telling us now, I think, is really important compared to all this kind of theoretical stuff. This is the stuff where the rubber hits the road.
Yeah, and I would just say that the fuel itself is actually significantly cheaper, for at least for our system, than when you think about uranium that's used, or high-assay low-enriched uranium for some of these advanced reactors. But the fact of the matter is that regardless of whether you're using a fission system or fusion system, you do have to refuel. So even in our existing nuclear power plants, you're usually looking at about a year and a half refueling cycle there. Same thing with our submarines that use high-enriched uranium. You still ultimately have to refuel those.
After how many years?
So, right. So I think that's still a challenge. I would say like our fuel amount that we use for a month in one of our systems can essentially be held in a canister the size of a bowling ball. So very small amounts.
Let me just say one thing. you mentioned 50 megawatts, size of a football field, 50 megawatts. What's the size of 500 megawatts?
So we're currently working on the design for the Nucor facility, but not significantly larger. The actual fusion machine itself won't increase in size that much. What will is the footprint of the power electronics that support the direct electricity capture that we have that then puts that electricity to our customer.
Nucor's in the new plant they're building in West Virginia.
Oh,
Yeah, that's where it's at, and they had a contract with them now, partnering up to see if they can basically run their steel mill off of fusion.
Chairman, that's why it's important we pin these guys down on when we're going to get this. You and I aren't going to be around that much longer.
Right.
We're on the clock.
I'm just saying, I think you'd like to have some of that heavy water to get to Neptune.
Right.
Where did Neptune come in? Where did that? That's
Well, I was trying to think of Pluto, but Neptune came to mind quicker. So. I was actually looking for a Star Trek reference, but you know.
Neptune was good.
Yeah.
Let me just say to all three of you, this has been extremely helpful for all of us. We know it's something that's coming, it's something that's needed. We're looking at every way we can to energize our country for the demand we're going to have with the new data centers and everything. And we've had hearings on the constraints we're going to have if we don't basically have this new technology. We've invested, I think, in so many ways. The IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure bill has given us more opportunities to bring things to fruition that we can share with the rest of the world. So I want to thank you for that. And all members are going to have until the close of business tomorrow to submit additional questions that we haven't asked today. So I want to thank you again for coming. And with that, we're adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.